Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you. It's very kind of you. And thank you for the very generous introduction. It is much appreciated, Bob. First of all, I just want to acknowledge Governor Pat Quinn, who his kind words about me are much appreciated. Congressman Mike Quigley, Cook County Board President Terry Preckwinkle, Pioneer Award winner Bob Jeffers. We're going to get to that, I guess. Precinct Committee Person of the Year Nasir Jahangir, and DPDC Executive Director Amy Rohr, and of course Bob Pikert. Just great people, and I also want to acknowledge WCPT. And if you listen to our program on WCPT, please call the advertisers, the sponsors, even if you don't need to buy their products. Just call them up and say, you know, I heard you on this radio station, and I want you to know that I'm with you. I'll pass along the good word about your product, because you know, they need your support. And this is the way that you can support commercial radio. Okay. All of that said, oh, and one other thing that I want to add: you've got to give some money to the DuPage Dems here on the table, and that's already been pitched. But at the bottom of this, you might not have noticed, there's a "Would you like to volunteer?" And hopefully by the end of my talk, you'll get why it's so important that you consider filling that out if you're not already doing so, and becoming a participant. Even if you don't have the means to contribute any more money, but becoming a participant in these things or getting others to. So anyhow, let me just get into this. What I wanted to talk about tonight is this fundamental difference between Democrats and Republicans, this fundamental schism that's been going on in the United States for the better part of a century. And you know, we all know the old jokes. You know, the Will Rogers, I don't belong to an organized political party, I'm a Democrat. Chris Matthews saying, you know, Republicans want a leader, Democrats want a meeting, stuff like that. And there's actually some truth to these things, in as much as Democrats, by and large, support the concept of small d democracy. That is, everybody gets to participate. We're a we society rather than a me society. We're all in this together. And when you look at the Republican Party, and literally since the 1880s, when they became captives of the railroad industry and have been basically the handmaidens for giant industries and very, very wealthy individuals who lean in that direction, you know, for this century and a quarter anyway, they have been the party of patriarchy, and all you have to do is look at Darrell Issa with 5 men testifying about birth control. The party of hierarchy, you know, it's yes sir, who's the leader, who's going to be in charge, and the party of this bizarre notion of social Darwinism. Rich people are rich, and it's a wonderful thing because they're job creators. They're going to give you a job, isn't that marvelous? And therefore, we should all give them an extra $1 billion. The concept of social Darwinism that the Republican Party, the modern Republican Party, and the philosophy, the modern conservative philosophy is grounded in, is based on flawed science. And I want to share that science with you for just a moment, because this is like a really important thing to understand and share with other people. And this is like the largest frame in which we can put our arguments. First of all, it started out back in 1859. Charles Darwin published *Origin of the Species*, and you know, it's a fascinating book. I've actually read most of it, and one of the interesting things of it, *Origin of the Species*, is that the phrase "survival of the fittest" only appears once in that book. And in that context, in that one place where it appears in the book, Darwin was actually talking about how most organisms are cooperative rather than competitive, even though there's an element of survival of the fittest in nature. Well, 20 years later, Sir Francis Galton, his cousin, in 1883, picked up this idea of survival of the fittest and popularized it. The reason why we all know about this phrase is not because of Darwin. Darwin did not like using this phrase. It's because of his cousin, Sir Francis Galton, who was the founder of the modern eugenics movement, who thought that, you know, we need to weed out undesirable people from the human race, and who was an economist and used this survival of the fittest to justify the economic order of the United Kingdom in the late 19th century. that there would be a very small class of very wealthy, super fit people, a small middle class of basically physicians and merchants, and a very, very large class of the working poor. And in fact, you go back and read Thomas Paine in his Agrarian Justice, he rails on the maximum wage laws that they used to have in England. Thomas Paine proposed back in the 1790s the first minimum wage laws in the United States, in addition to, in that book, proposing Social Security and Medicare and a lot of things that we have now. You could track it back to Paine. But they had these maximum wage laws to keep the poor from ever becoming the middle class, because of this conservative notion that was championed by the conservatives of the day. Certain people like Sir Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine stopped at Burke's home in England for 2 weeks on his way to the French Revolution, and was so pissed off by his 2-week-long debate with Edmund Burke that he wrote an entire book called The Rights of Man as a rebuttal to Burke. Burke, by the way, the entire first chapter of Russell Kirk's 1951 book, The Conservative Mind, which was the foundation of Goldwater's theories and was the foundation of William F. Buckley's theories, and today is quoted by any conservative, any competent, well-educated conservative knows Russell Kirk. The entire first chapter is about Sir Edmund Burke. So anyhow, they all were operating on this theory that survival of the fittest is where it's all at, and that the most powerful are the most powerful because they should be, no matter how they got there, how they clawed their way to the top. And this is the natural order of things. And how do they know that? Because if you look in nature, you find that there are alpha animals. You see the deer, the male deer in mating season, they're colliding into each other and fighting with each other. And there's alpha animals. Sometimes they're females. In wolf packs, it's females, the alpha female. But there's an alpha animals in so many of these species. And so, Galton said, here's proof. Humans, we're mammals. We must be just like this too. Nobody tested that. Nobody questioned that for 100 years. It just became kind of the prevailing notion, and it became the basis for economic and political theory that we know today as modern conservative Republican theory. In the United States, it has other names in other places. So about 8 years ago, 2 scientists at the University of Essex in the UK decided, let's test this. Let's test this hypothesis. Conrad and Roper were their names, Tim Conrad and L. Roper. And they put up cameras. The university had this, a fellow by the name of Randerson actually ran the experiment for them. They put up these cameras. They had this near the university, they had this sanctuary where there was a herd of red deer, about 100 or so of them. And they put up cameras in the trees and observed them for a year. Let's see what's going on with these deer. Because they knew that this was a species where they had these alpha animal battles. And the question was, how does the herd know when it's time to stop grazing and go to one of the 3 watering holes in the area? How do they know when to make that decision? And how do they know which one of the 3 water holes to go to? And these are actually really critical decisions, because if they stop grazing too early, you're going to have some members of the community who aren't going to get enough nutrients, enough nutrition. If they stop grazing too late, some may get dehydrated. There's, which water hole to go to. Is there a predator around? I mean, there's all kinds of variables here. And this is actually important decision making. And the assumption that they went in with on this was that it must be the alpha deer who makes the decision and everybody else follows him. Because isn't that what we've been told ever since Darwin? But what they discovered was that the deer would be, wandering around, grazing, and when it came around 1 or 2 in the afternoon, about the time that they'd all go drink, they noticed that, a couple of deer would start pointing while they were grazing, they would start eating, nibbling trees or whatever they do, chewing their cuds or something. While they were doing that, they would start pointing their heads toward one of the 3 watering holes. And that when 51% of the deer, literally 51% of the deer were pointing toward one particular watering hole, the entire herd en masse would just go to that watering hole. And very often the alpha deer was standing in the back going, oh, where did everybody go? Off they go. And they thought, this is amazing. This is democratic decision-making. Small d democratic decision-making. It's community, not hierarchy. So they thought, well, we've got to figure out a way to evoke the alpha male. We've got to get him to show his leadership. So they put a predator near one of the water holes, the one that was closest to where the deer were. And the deer, instinctively, they could smell him. They knew that, okay, there's a predator over there, a wolf or some kind of cat or something, I forget what it was. And the deer didn't know that the predator was staked out, couldn't get them, but they knew that there was danger. And so they're watching these deer, the predator day. And let's say there's 100 in the herd, just to make it easy. And the 49th one is pointing at one particular watering hole, and then the 50th one, and then the 51st one, and that's the point at which they'd normally go, and nothing happens. And they're going, this is it. Now the alpha male is going to assert his authority. And we're going to see that, what Sir Francis Galton told us all about back in 1883. And then the 52nd, and the 53rd, and the 54th, and the 55th, and the 56th, and 57th, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63... what would 2/3 be? 66, right? Okay, 64, 65. And when the 66th one was pointing toward one of the watering holes, again, the whole herd went. And again, very often the alpha male had no idea what the hell was going on. So what they deduced out of this is that when there's danger, you have to have a supermajority vote. Right? Seriously. So they published this in Nature, which is like one of the top scientific journals in the world. Nature and Science are probably the two most prestigious journals out there. And I read it in Nature, and I was in the middle of writing a book called What Would Jefferson Do at the time? And I thought, this is amazing, because Thomas Jefferson wrote about this in his diaries. When Louise and I moved to Vermont back in 1996, we sold an ad agency in Atlanta and retired to Vermont, and the retirement got blown away by my starting my radio show in 2003. But in any case, we moved to Vermont. We bought this house, and it was built in 1851. And up in the attic of the house when we moved in was a couple of boxes of old ratty books that had been rain damaged and been up there since the 1930s. There was some magazines and things in the 1930s. And in the bottom of one of them, I found a complete collection, 20-volume collection of the collected works of Thomas Jefferson. It's only been published once in the history of the country in 1909, in the 100th anniversary of the end of his presidency, by the Thomas Jefferson Association. And I had a fair amount of time on my hands, and I wanted to write a book about Jefferson. I've always been fascinated by him. So I spent the next year reading Jefferson, reading his diaries, reading his letters, reading all, and fascinating. Jefferson was obsessed with this idea of ground-up democracy and believed that it was the natural course of things. When he wrote the Declaration of Independence, he wrote in there, "Nature's God." John Adams came along to edit it. John Adams, John Jay, and Ben Franklin sat with Thomas Jefferson for 2 days after he wrote the first draft and edited it. And you can see this in the old originals. John Adams, who was a good Christian, scratched out the word nature's God and put in the Christian God. And Thomas Jefferson scratched out the Christian God and put in nature's God. He thought that this was the natural order of things, that people would govern themselves. So, anyhow, I called up Tim Roper, one of these two scientists, and I said, I'm writing this book called What Would Jefferson Do? And I think that your research has validated, and I got some of the quotes in the book, things that I'd read in Jefferson's diaries and things, where he was observing Native American communities that are run very democratically, and he was also observing nature. And I said, what happened when you published this in Nature? And Tim Roper said, it was incredible. He said, one of the first scientists who called me was an ichthyologist, fish scientist. You ever seen a school of fish? I remember the first time I went scuba diving, and there was like this school of fish. It was off the coast of Hawaii. There was like this school of these bright yellow fish, and they were just going along, and all of a sudden they just go whoop like that, and they go whoop like that. And I thought, this is proof of telepathy, right? It's got to be. It's proof of telepathy. And he said, so they did like this slow motion stuff on the fish, and they discovered that when 51% of the fish in the school move a quarter inch to the right, the entire school moves to the right. That they're voting. With every pull of their fins, they are voting. And when a majority is achieved, they go in that direction. He said, we heard from ornithologists. They were saying, we're seeing the same thing in birds, flocks of birds. He said, an entomologist called and said, you know, we've seen this with termites, right? We're seeing this with ants. It turns out that every species, without exception, is small d democratic in the way they govern themselves, the way that they make their decisions. They are all we societies rather than me societies. So then I asked the question, well, then why have alpha males, or females for that matter? And he said, oh, that just has to do with sexual selection. The alpha male gets first choice of mate. But they very, very rarely, almost never, have any authority or say over the community. He said there's a few exceptions, but there are very narrow exceptions. For example, the alpha female in a wolf pack will lead the hunt, but she has no say over how the meat is distributed. She has no say over other things like that, and she gets first choice of mate. So that was it. I mean, he just blew up, not Darwin, because Darwin, I think, frankly, would have agreed with us, but blew up all the people who've tried to twist Darwin over the years to justify, you know, modern conservative and Republican notions that are just crazy. These notions, you know, they're aggressively out there trying to redefine freedom. This is the word that they use, freedom. In July of 1936, Franklin Roosevelt accepted the nomination of his party for his second term as president in Philadelphia. It was July 27th, as I recall. And he said, an old English judge once said, a necessitous man is not a free man. Well, the Republicans would argue with that, and they argued loudly with Franklin Roosevelt about that, and they argue it to this day. In the Republican world, or the conservative world, freedom is the freedom to die in the gutter without health care, as they so eloquently shouted at Ron Paul during the debate, right? Let him die! That's freedom. Democrats know that freedom is having the basis of health care for all so that you are free to then go on with your life and be more successful in other areas and do things, you know, be successful. Democrats understand this. Republicans say that freedom means the freedom to contract with an all-powerful employer, particularly in a bad job market where you basically have no choices, and the freedom to work a 70-hour week and work yourself to death under conditions where you've got no protections whatsoever, because after all, you're free to quit. You're free to live in poverty. You're free to be a greeter at Walmart. Isn't that wonderful? You're free to not have a union. Democrats understand that freedom means having a decent job and having a guarantee of a decent job and a decent wage at that job so that you can then get on with the rest of your life and be free. Republicans believe, and conservatives believe, that freedom means the freedom to graduate from college $100,000 in debt and to be basically a servant to the is that my phone bonging? It is, my goodness. Sorry about that. And basically be a servant to the banksters. And Democrats and progressives understand that, you know, this is so alien to the history of the United States. Thomas Jefferson wrote his own tombstone about a decade before he died. He had been president of the United States for 2 terms, and he did not want that on his tombstone. It wasn't that he was ashamed of it, he was quite proud of it. But what he thought was far more important was that he was the author of the Virginia piece of legislation for religious freedom. This was back when he was in the House of Burgesses in his 20s, which became the basis of part of the First Amendment. That he was the author of the Declaration of Independence, and that he founded the University of Virginia as a free college, that any American qualified could get a free education. And he wrote about this over and over and over again, that you cannot have a functioning democracy without an informed and well-educated electorate, and it is the obligation of government to make sure that that is available to everybody. Republicans think that freedom, or suggest, in fact, they come right out and say it. Paul Ryan basically, you know, look at the budget that he just passed. Freedom means you have the freedom to retire in poverty, you know, with privatized Social Security, and oh, you want a health insurance plan? Here's an $8,000 voucher. Good luck, Grandma. You know, Democrats understand that freedom means having your basic health care needs absolutely taken care of so that you are free to conduct your life with dignity and happiness and pursue happiness, as it were. And in fact, let me add to that. This is truly fascinating. This whole concept of freedom based on the pursuit of happiness, when Jefferson wrote that into the Declaration of Independence, that was not an accident, and it wasn't a throwaway line. He was dead serious about this. And so were the founders. I mean, I get these conservatives on who say, oh, well, you know, it's health care for everybody, that's nonsense. And I say, do you know what the name is of the first president who signed legislation providing free health care to poor people? Well, I don't know, what was it, Lyndon Johnson? No, it was George Washington. I mean, this was a founding concept. So the freedom to, well, anyhow, I made the point. And the freedom to pursue happiness, the point I was going to make about that was the first time, when he put the word happiness in the Declaration of Independence, it was the first time that word had ever appeared in the history of the world in the founding document of a country. You want to know what American exceptionalism is? That's a big piece of it. That and the fact that we were also one of the first, arguably the first nation, certainly in several centuries, several millennia, where your citizenship and your rights were not derived from your DNA. In all other countries, now, of course, we had that to some extent with slavery. But we've worked through that. But in the conceptualization, this was what came out of the Enlightenment, was that at the end of the day, it's not, you're a Dane if your great-grandparents were Danish. You're a German if your great-great-grandparents were Germans. Hitler's whole thing was Blut und Erde, blood and earth. You've got the blood of Germans is in the soil, and the soil's got the DNA of Germans, and that's what. But America, we said, no, anybody can be an American. That's this extraordinary exceptionalism. But conservatives, they look at this, at the nation, and they say, oh, yeah, you're free to get cancer from, the air because we're going to deregulate the companies that are pumping crap into it, or from the water because, hey, there's a little arsenic in it, but don't worry, or from the food that you're eating, it might kill you, but hey, we've got freedom, right? No big government interfering in it. And Democrats understand that, no, freedom means knowing that those parts of the commons, and basically everything I've been talking about here is the commons, that those parts of the commons are taken care of by we, the people, that's what it's all about. Republicans are suggesting, and conservatives suggest, that freedom means that you have the freedom to be basically robbed by the banksters periodically, and just to be literally at the mercy of large institutional systems. Oh, your credit card company just decided to change the rules of the game. They just decided to double your interest. Hey, that's freedom. Isn't that great? Democrats understand that if you're going to have people doing business in your society, particularly the business of banking, but generally any business, when you allow that business, you are granting a whole set of privileges to the business people, and being one, I'm very grateful for them, but along with those privileges should come a set of responsibilities to honor the commons and respect and work for the people, the good of the people, the common good. Republicans suggest that if you run a small business like mine, I've got 8 employees, I think, right now, and I've run a whole bunch of small businesses throughout my life, that if you run a small business, you're free to get crushed by a monopoly. We were at a mall for lunch earlier, actually, I think maybe, yeah, and you told me about the open-air mall that was built in '62, and I said, I'll bet in '62 every store in that open-air mall was locally owned. Maybe there was an anchor store like a Sears, but everything else was locally owned. And those of you old enough to remember, before Ronald Reagan became president, remember when you could walk into any downtown or any strip mall and see stores that had been in families for generations. And then Reagan in '82 stopped enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act, and we suddenly had these people called M&A artists, mergers and acquisitions, the mergers and acquisition frenzy, and now we've got basically monopolies in every industry. You could drop out of an airplane from 60,000 feet and fall into any city in America and not have any clue where you are, because it's always, oh, there's an Applebee's, there's a Macy's, it's all the same thing. All the small businesses have been wiped out, and in every industry you see 3 or 4 massive companies dominating that industry with a few sprinkled around the edges, giving some patina to it. So the Republicans say, if you're a small businessman, you're free to be crushed by the competition. And what Democrats and progressives know is that's not competition. That's monopoly. And that's unhealthy, and that's wrong, and we need to be enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act and bring back our small businesses. Republicans say, oh, you're free to watch hundreds of channels on television. You know, you're free to have all kinds of entertainment. What they don't tell you is that those hundreds of channels are owned by 6 corporations, and that you will never hear an honest discussion of free trade, for example, on those or problems with trade, or should we have a national trade policy, which we haven't had since the Reagan administration, or should we have a national manufacturing policy, which we haven't had since the Reagan administration, or should we have a national energy policy like the one that Jimmy Carter put into place, where in 1979 he said this nation will never again import more oil than we did in 1978 when we were importing 21% of our oil. It's now well over 50. He said we will never again do that, and that he was signing legislation, which he did. He put it into place that would, by the year 2000, produce 20% of the nation's electricity from solar electricity, solar generation alone, and it would have. And then and in fact, I remember when Louise and I moved to Vermont, we were looking for a house, and it's a very rural state, traveling around the state looking at houses, and about every 5th or 8th house or so that we'd see was off the grid or mostly off the grid. And all of them were built in 79 and 80. You know, when Carter had those tax credits for building energy efficient homes, and then Reagan came in and pulled Carter's solar panels off the roof of the White House and said, to hell with that, we're not going to have an energy policy. We're going to go with the oil barons that put him into office. So it's just nuts. Democrats understand that we need to have a national energy policy that gets us energy independent and that is a clean energy policy so that we can have a safe environment and a safe nation. And that we don't need to be subsidizing the oil and nuclear industries anymore, in my humble opinion. Republicans say, you're free, just ask the Supreme Court, just ask John Roberts or Anthony Scalia or Clarence Thomas or Sam Alito or Kennedy kind of reluctantly went along with it. You're free to have your laws written by lobbyists, and you're free to have billionaires come in and say I'm going to take the money that I made in a casino off the coast of China and Macau and use that to turn this Republican candidate into the front runner. Isn't that cool? And it's like you look at the Republican candidates and okay, which billionaires are behind which ones, and they're getting up. They're right up front about it. It's oh yeah, I'm the guy who put up $10 million to keep so and so in there. And now Santorum's got his billionaire, Foster Friess, who put his foot in his mouth with his aspirin between your knees comment the other day. But Rick Santorum wouldn't exist without this guy, without a billionaire. Republicans say, oh, that's freedom. It's freedom to have politicians who are owned and have laws that are written by the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, this group funded by the Koch brothers, where twice a year they get together, and literally corporations pay $100,000 each to have a seat at the table. State legislators pay $100 each to have a seat at the table, and they try to get a 50-50 split of state legislators and corporations, and they vote on model legislation, like, for example, voter ID laws and things like this, and they put forward these insane pieces of legislation in states all over the country. Republicans say that's freedom. Democrats and progressives understand that money does corrupt the political process, that we need to get money out of the political process, and that we need to have a clean and transparent electoral system. So, in summary, what this all pulls together is the idea, if you add all those things up that I just listed, that were basically all came out of Franklin Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights that he rolled out just in the year before he died and really needs to be revived, that what they're really all about is creating a strong middle class. It's like in the Red Deer community, there might be a small elite, a couple of them, the alpha males, but they're not really all that elite, and they don't have that much control over anybody else, and pretty much everybody else has the same say. And that's how it works in all of the rest of nature. And Jefferson, in fact, in one of his letters, he said, and I'm doing this from memory, and it's been a while. But he said, he was talking about cannibalism, and he said, for man is the only species in nature which devours his own, for there can be no other description than the general prey of the rich upon the poor. You know, I mean, it was just this brilliant, I remember coming across this quote going, oh, you know, and what this is all about is, you know, it's okay to have the rich, and maybe the poor will be with us always. I don't know. I think that, though, the experience of many nations shows us that it's possible to largely minimize that. You know, to live by the standards of the world's major religions and say we are going to care for the hungry, and we are going to house the homeless, and we are going to heal the sick, and we are going to visit those in prison unjustly and have fewer in prison unjustly. One other thing, Republicans say, oh yeah, you're free to have a private prison corporation making money off the commons and lobbying for stronger, you know, 3 strikes and you're out laws and stronger drug laws and all this kind of stuff. And I would say, you know, the rest of us know that, no, the commons should be sacrosanct. The things the government does are sacred. That, you know, people, you know, for 230 years, men and women have fought and died to protect the commons of the United States, the things that we all administer. And we get it, that's the appropriate role of government and what we need to be doing. So, with tax policies, rational regulation, and bringing back labor into the mix. This is arguably one of the most important thing if you want to build a strong middle class, because everything I'm talking about here is the middle class, and that is that a workplace is basically a kingdom. It's a hierarchy. It's the kind of kingdoms that don't exist in the rest of nature. And in order to balance the power of accumulated wealth, you need the power of accumulated labor, right? If you've got aggregated wealth that has special privileges from the state, which is the whole point of incorporation, then labor should have sufficient power to be able to balance that. And that labor does it via a process called democracy, small d democracy. Labor unions are quite simply nothing more or less than democracy in the workplace. And we get it, and the Republicans don't, or they just hate democracy. So what all of this does, what all of this means, is that if enough of us get involved, you know, we've got to all be the deer, right? In Randerson's experiment, everybody has to participate. If enough of us get involved, if enough of you, you know, fill out that yes, I'll volunteer. Yes, I'd like to be a precinct committee person. Yes, I'd like to help out. Yes, I'd like to participate. If we hit some reasonable critical threshold where Americans are once again engaged in politics and realize that voting isn't the end of the process, voting is the beginning of the process. If we can do this, if we can build this, well, you saw this here, this Operation Turn to Page Blue that Bob was telling you about. This is so cool. This started basically as a motivational theme in 2007. You know, there weren't all that many Democrats showing up, and hey, you know, let's try to pump some life into this thing. And he put together this, Bob and a group of people put together this thing called Turn to Page Blue. It became a movement, and now it's become an organization, basically. They've dramatically increased the visibility of the Democratic Party. They've mobilized Democrats, and they're recruiting people to participate in the Democratic Party. I get progressives who call up my show all the time and go, you know, the Democrats are just like the Republicans, and they're not doing anything, and Obama sold us out, and Bill Clinton wasn't that good. And I say, when was the last time you went to a Democratic Party meeting? Long silence, right? And then I say to them, you have no damn right to be complaining about the Democratic Party if you're not participating and taking it over, making it vibrant and alive and active, and making it a force in America. So, all that said, get out there, get active, tag, you're it. Thanks so much for showing up tonight.